All right, as we talk about school choice here in South Carolina, I'm very happy to have a special guest on our show, Randan Steinhauser. How you doing, Randan? For coming to us from Austin, Texas, but you've got some serious South Carolina roots, don't you?
Yeah, their roots and they're still growing. I grew up in South Carolina. My family's all still there. I am here in Austin, Texas. I married a Texan, so that's what they do. They kidnap you to the Lone Star State. But all my family's there. I graduated from the University of South Carolina and got my start working in South Carolina politics.
Well, you said a few of the experiences you had here in the Palmetto State helped shape your views on the issue we're going to talk about today, school choice. Tell us a little bit about that, how your time here kind of influenced you politically.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand kind of that foundation of my philosophy, which started, growing up in rural South Carolina, living with and growing up with a single mom, and working my way through college by working at the Piggly Wiggly. And so my first interaction with the government was them taking away my tax dollars. And I took my paycheck home to my mom and said, "Who the heck is FICA? And why are they taking my money?" And so that really started an interesting conversation. Everyone in my family was small business owners. And so there was this real understanding of hard work and determination, kind of leave us alone mentality, individual responsibility, limited government. And so that led me to study political science, and ended up working in Governor Sanford's office in 2007. During the 2008 presidential campaign, I was able to go to one of the Myrtle Beach debates. And that was the first time that I heard Dr. Ron Paul speak. And it was like a flame of liberty just ignited. And from then, I started working for Ron Paul for president on campus. I was the campus organizer for his campaign during that cycle, and just really got involved in kind of the liberty movement, pushing for those principles, those core conservative principles that I care very much about. That led me up to DC, working for then Senator Jim DeMint. And I guess, as they say, the rest is history. But it really laid the foundation, I think, growing up in the Palmetto State, again, in that rural community, in a family of small business owners, first generation college student, to really understand those foundational principles of conservatism, but also those values that are driven in part by our faith. And I think we can talk about that in the conversation around education, but I certainly know that it was my own education, growing up K through 12, but also University of South Carolina, and then going on to get my master's, that put me in the position I'm able to be in today to advocate for other parents.
Absolutely. You walked through that pedigree. Those are a trio of elected officials that have been very consistent in those pro-free market libertarian views. Unfortunately, in South Carolina, Washington, D.C., in fact, in most state governments across the country, it is rare that those principles are applied in the policy arena. It's rare that we see those campaign promises and the rhetoric from these politicians translate into policies that are actually consistent with that rhetoric. And nowhere is that disconnect larger than education. Randan, tell us a little bit about YAL, about this group you're involved with, about what they're doing to try and, again, bridge that gap to get some of these conservative talking points actually implemented for a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it started as the Ron Paul effort, right? It was started on campus many years ago, over 10 years ago, and transitioned to become Young Americans for Liberty. And I'm proud to serve as their national school choice director. I've been working on this issue, honestly, since my time in Sanford's office was the first time I kind of heard about school choice, had no idea about it otherwise. During my time in Washington, after I went and worked for DeMint, I actually ended up working for Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. This was before she was the secretary at the American Federation for Children, the nation's largest school choice organization. And so that was really the beginning for me personally to understand how the philosophy of educational freedom can be supported through sound public policy that really focuses on empowering parents with choice. So recently I was asked to join the team at Young Americans for Liberty as their national school choice director, working in a number of different states with members of our Hazlitt coalition. So if you're a free market economist supporter, you understand the implications of being a member of the Hazlitt coalition. You have to support limited government, conservative public policy, free market economics, free people. And so we have these members of the Hazlitt Coalition. We have several in South Carolina that are pushing for universal school choice. And I'm sure we'll get into that specific policy. But this organization is active in hundreds of college campuses across the country to mobilize college students to get involved in the fight for liberty, involved in the Hazlitt Coalition by supporting legislators at the state level, as well as working at the national level to just drive that conversation around liberty.
Well, let's drill down a little bit into some of these policies. Here in South Carolina, last count, we're pushing the $18,000 mark per year per student in the government-run system, and that's a system that continues to produce substandard outcomes, whether it's on the state level report cards, but more importantly on those national apples-to-apples metrics like NAEP, the nation's report card. We continue to fall further behind as that government investment increases. So I'll just point blanket with you. What's the answer? What school? I mean, everyone talks about school choice. What specific solution are you and your group pushing for, and what do you mean by that term universal school choice?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think first and foremost, one of the big answers is getting government out of the way. Right now, we have a behemoth of a system that is designed to teach to the middle and support and protect the status quo. We have way too many administrators. We have way too much of those dollars that you mentioned not even going into the classroom. And so our focus over the last 50 years, right, we've seen the focus shift from being child-centered to system-centered, where it's focused on protecting the system, protecting the buildings, the jobs. There's not enough conversations about what's best for the individual student. Look, you and I both know as parents that every single child learns differently. I'm now the mother of 4, including a set of identical twins. And even my identical twins learn differently. So there's no way you can make the compelling case to me that a system serving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of students, as we have here in Texas, is in any way designed to meet their individual needs. I think what we would love to see is taking away the focus from that system and allowing parents to identify a variety of ways that their child can learn. Our family is unique. We do a hybrid homeschooling approach. So 2 days a week, my kids are at a private Christian school. Otherwise, they're at home and we're learning together. That works for our family. It matches our values. It matches our structure. It's what we want to do as a family. Other families may choose that traditional neighborhood school if it's the right fit for them. But if it's not, and it's not working, you should be able to take those dollars that have been allocated for your child's education and use them how you see fit. The term universal really means allowing those dollars to be spent in a multitude of ways. So traditionally, over the last 30 years, we've seen voucher programs. Vouchers are specifically focused on taking state dollars and putting them towards private school tuition. Mm-hmm. I think we've seen the rise of education savings accounts in this post-COVID world, where we recognize as parents, gosh, it sure does seem like there's a lot of wasted time. Our kids are in school 5 days a week, 7 hours a day. There has to be a better way. We have sucked the joy out of learning for so many kids, right? They get to 3rd, 4th grade, and all of a sudden you see that sparkle of interest, that curiosity just diminish. And I would argue that that's because we are putting them in a coercive environment where they are being forced to sit and be quiet and listen to information being delivered to them by an adult, right? This sounds awful. I can think back to my own experience and think, gosh, I know there was wasted time. And time is our most precious commodity. So parents are kind of rising up and saying, no more. I don't want my children in this coercive environment, especially if it's undermining our family's values, which, as we know, these government schools now are doing everything they can to take away any mention of traditional family values, any mention of faith, and not only taking it away, but openly mocking it.
Well, and replacing it, obviously, with the new woke orthodoxy, so to speak. We'll get into that in a minute. I do want to ask you about how that's impacting the nationwide climate for choice, but I want to go back. You mentioned universal as being related to how this money can be spent. One of the things I wanted to ask you as we look at states like Arizona, which have passed what I would consider to be universal choice legislation, I'm thinking of it more from the perspective of who is eligible and how much money? Obviously, you're looking at the output side, but before we get to that, who should be eligible for choice? And if among that population, how much money should they get? Let's take South Carolina with that $18,000 per year per child. What percentage of that, Randan, do you think should be in the hands of parents to decide as they see fit?
100%. 100%. They're your tax dollars. They're your child. You're already paying property taxes. In South Carolina, we know there's a lot of room for improvement in the amount of money the government's already taking from us. So let's give it back to the parents, allow them that freedom to choose how their child is educated. If they choose to go to a private education institution and use 100% of the ESA in that way, that's great. If they want to do curriculum, homeschooling, tutoring, therapy, whatever it is to have that education that works for their child. But you're right. In terms of universal, that's a key term because it means every single child. This is not a place for carve-outs. This is not a place to say because you live in this zip code or you have this learning difference or because your parents make this much money. There is no limit on what a child can learn. And so I believe in Young Americans for Liberty and many other organizations that have helped to pass very strong universal ESA programs across the country believe that every single child, no matter what. Now, does that mean that there should be prioritization of students who come from a family with low income background or students with special needs? Sure, absolutely. But at the same time, access to the education savings account should be available to every single school-age child in the Palmetto State. And unfortunately, some of the opportunities we're seeing in the legislature, they continue in South Carolina, they continue to carve out these populations to make it smaller and smaller and smaller, therefore preventing hundreds of thousands of students from accessing these programs if they pass.
Well, South Carolina, obviously one of the most ostensibly conservative states in America, although you've probably seen the same reports that we've seen. American Conservative Union, their ratings have South Carolina as the most fiscally liberal Republican legislature in the country 3 years running. Obviously, that has helped block meaningful school choice legislation from making through, in fact, any school choice legislation from making its way through the legislative process. But as you look at the bills currently on the docket, currently up for debate, Randan, do you see anything worth passing? Is there anything that South Carolina parents should get behind legislatively right now?
I would argue that what I'm seeing from the establishment-led Republican caucus in South Carolina is that they want to herald a win for school choice without it actually being a win, to be honest with you. It's not going to be a win for parents if they pass some of the proposals that are currently being discussed.
Give us an example. What's an example of one of those, I guess, choice and name only bills?
Right. I mean, again, they're carving out those populations. So we are advocating for universal. That's you nailed it, right? That's the key point. So as they continue to put income limitations or there's always going to be rural carve outs, right? This is the protection, the status quo, protecting their schools, and their superintendents are very loud. They're going to hear from them and they're going to start to carve out the communities. They're going to say, we passed something that's school choice light, but in reality, we've seen other states do it. We've seen it in Arizona. All across the country right now it's happening. And so there's no reason that a state like South Carolina with this Republican legislature should not pass a universal school choice bill.
But instead, what you're telling me they're looking for is more of a talking point than actual policy that's going to impact that parental paradigm, that fundamental, right of a parent to decide how they want that tax money to be spent.
Well, they're not only carving out populations. Another key point is that they continue to cut down the amount of money that a family would receive. So it's allowing some of those state dollars to stay with the schools that are not having to educate the child. This is kind of that negotiation with the status quo of saying, look, we'll get the kid out of your system and you get to keep money, and the parents get less than their tax dollars are currently allocated for that child's education. So all of these sort of watering down of free market choice, of choosing certain populations, carving out others, limiting the amount of money that the program would include, capping the program, right? That's another thing that we often see with Republican legislators who want to claim success with school choice, is that they put a cap cap on the program. So they may say it's universal, but guess what? There's only so many dollars allocated toward it, or there's only, it could only have 6,000 students in its pilot year. I'm sorry, it's just not good enough.
All right. And meanwhile, the public system continues to grow exponentially with absolutely no thought to the diminishing returns that taxpayers and parents are getting for those investments. Randy, let me ask you two quick things before you go. I know you're very busy. I want to be mindful of your time, but I do want to ask you two quick questions. You talked about these efforts to minimize the amount of choice, whether it's through those caps, whether it's through those carve-outs. Let me ask you this question. Doesn't it seem, based on this post-COVID world that we're living in, where parents have now had their eyes really opened to some of that indoctrination that their children are being pushed, some of the indoctrination being pushed on their kids, don't you think this is the time for conservative lawmakers or Republican lawmakers to be more aggressive in pushing for expanded choice, not less aggressive, not compromising? I mean, but it sounds to me like in South Carolina, at any rate, these bills are moving in the wrong direction, not toward that universal goal.
Yeah, I would say two things. First, I'd actually talk about the other side of the aisle, which are our Democrat lawmakers, right? The populations that benefit most predominantly across the country in private school choice programs are low-income African-American Hispanic families that traditionally vote Democrat in general elections. There's a disconnect between the public policy of the Democratic Party and their constituents and their desires to get out of these broken government schools. They are stuck in the failing schools. So I think first and foremost, I would point out the hypocrisy of the progressive left when they talk about supporting individual rights and freedom and their intentional blocking of school choice programs, not only in South Carolina, but across the country. Look, it was Randy Weingarten who told the schools to stay shut. Our schools shut down. They wanted to mask our kids. They're talking about vaccine mandates. This is all coming from the radical progressive left. Again, they have an accountability that needs to be talked about when it comes to political parties and standing in the way of this. Now, on the flip side, do the Republicans also need to be held accountable? Absolutely. This is not the time to stand in the way of parents who are, quite frankly, fed up with the indoctrination that's happening, not to mention the school safety issues. My niece, who again lives in the Midlands, her school has been shut down or closed down 3 or 4 times in the spring semester already for different violent acts or threats to the campus. These things are happening in our schools, and parents not only are concerned about the curriculum, the teachings of the classroom, the undermining of our faith and our values, they're concerned about their child's safety. We've got to get these government schools under control because, quite frankly, parents are desperate. And if they can't afford to go to a private school or they can't take the time to homeschool, they are stuck.
Yeah, you're right. No, I tell you what, you were talking about that partisan the racial divide, the partisan divide. It's amazing to think that the modern American school choice movement was actually driven by African American leaders up in Milwaukee. Polly Williams and some of her allies up there, they started that first really mainstream school choice program up in the Milwaukee public school system years ago. Let me ask you this, Randan, a little bit of a tough question. A lot of groups come on, they'll talk about these reforms they're supporting, they'll talk about what lawmakers should do. But let me ask you this question. Your group, obviously we're heading into a big presidential year where the eyes of America will be on South Carolina as the first in the South Republican state and the first in the nation state on the Democratic side. What is your group going to do to push this issue here in South Carolina?
Well, the number one thing we're doing to push the issue right now is to support those candidates who are on the front lines of advocating for universal school choice. So you can go to our website, yaliberty.org, and you can see the members of our Hazlitt Coalition. It aligns pretty well with a different coalition that you may be familiar with in South Carolina that's going up against the establishment every single day and holding them accountable. And we're supporting those candidates. Right now, we are actively pushing back on false mail pieces that have been sent. We have mail pieces of our own that are going out this week. We have text message campaigns supporting those candidates in their fight for not only universal school choice, but for holding back against some of these large tax incentives that we're seeing go toward very successful multi-billion-dollar companies that are trying to relocate to South Carolina. We're pushing back on things like that woke agenda. And so holding ourselves accountable. And it's not just about public policy. It's about supporting those candidates who are on the front lines, willing to take a bold stand on behalf of parents and say, enough is enough. We are no longer beholden to this government-run system. Parents know best. Get government out of the way and support universal school choice. So we're supporting those individuals in the State House right now actively as we speak.
Randan Steinhauser, Young Americans for Liberty, want to thank you again for taking the time to share your group's work with us. Will you come back on, and more importantly, will you stop by and visit us if you make your way to South Carolina the next few months covering or working on some of these agenda items?
Absolutely, you bet. Thank you for having me.
We'd love to have you on. And once again, always welcome back here in South Carolina, and thank you for taking the time to educate our audience on this very important issue.